It was a creed written into the founding documents that declared the destiny of a nation. Yes, we can. It was whispered by slaves and abolitionists as they blazed the trail toward freedom. Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
It was sung
by immigrants as they struck out.
From WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. This is special programming, the African American vote in 2020. We start now a series here. This is on the leap day of February. In other words, it's 29th of February 2020. And what we'll attempt to do here is start off the contest with the African American vote. We've had a number of primaries, starting with Iowa. There was not as many African Americans in Iowa. And then we went on to New Hampshire. And then to Nevada. Now, Nevada was a different state, a more multi-ethnic state. Latinos make up about 30% of that state or more, and African Americans about 10% of the state. A lot of young people there. So Bernie had a blowout victory in Nevada. And then we come to South Carolina. Now, South Carolina is a different type of state. We've talked about it in a previous broadcast, the type of state it is. They have their godfather there, Jim Clyburn. Mr. Clyburn endorsed Joe Biden on a Wednesday, and no doubt that moved undecided African-American voters towards Joe Biden. And it is interesting that a lot of people had not made their mind up. That's the age-old argument in political science about where do the undecided go. Do they go to the prevailing candidate, at least in the political world of South Carolina? That would have been Joe Biden. He started out way ahead there. He called it his firewall. And in 2020, calling a state like South Carolina your firewall is a bit dated, to say the least. What is the reason for this? Well, first of all, South Carolina is a firm Republican state. Yes, followers of O.J. Simpson, African Americans, make up, and there's been some said 60%. We had updated here, I believe about 59% of the voters out there were today were African Americans, and a larger percentage there. And also it is a state that has older voters in it, and Joe Biden got the older voters, Bernie got the younger voters, and everyone met at the creek, so to speak. A totally different type of election than what we normally see these days, and so it turned out. Also, it is, as according to Congressman Klobuchar, a pragmatic state. The African Americans, they are pragmatic, and also they are in general much more conservative than in many of the other states they'll be going into. And we'll talk about some of those as far as the African American vote in this broadcast. It is different. It's a different type of state. All states are different. If you recall, we go back to historic run of then Senator from Illinois, Barack Obama. Jim Clyburn endorsed him, which was forward-looking. That was in 2008. And he was running, of course, against Hillary the Monster Clinton. Now, a totally different time in the spear, no doubt about that. So thus you got that endorsement. And if you look at these states, and South Carolina is identical to some other states, you'll see that various political functionaries, Democratic functionaries in South Carolina would automatically support Joe Lunchbox Biden. There's no doubt about that, and we contrast that with Virginia. A lot of African American voters in Virginia, and the political class, many of them in Virginia, have endorsed Biden. They haven't been as loud as they are now, because they didn't know if Biden could stay on the ship, if he would fall off of the ship. And that is very, very important. But back to South Carolina, you had Tom Steyer there, a billionaire that invested very heavily in South Carolina. Spent roughly $17-18 million on his campaign in that particular state, and he was there, his family was there, and he was very much embedded in the African American community there in South Carolina. And many of the polls, and we'll go to those in a minute here, that he was getting around 18, even 20% of the vote. We don't have the figures as of this broadcast from South Carolina. The Associated Press has projected him based upon the African American vote. That was about 60% there of the African American vote, which he was able to get in South Carolina. And also important to note here that the over 60 vote, he got a majority of that, and whereas Bernie got a majority of people under 30, and that was about 11% or so. The turnout there in South Carolina was not as high amongst young people as in some other states. And also the Latino element was virtually missing in South Carolina. And when you add all of that up with the Stop Bernie campaign, very, very big around the U.S., they have several candidates. And now Mini Mike, known as Bloomberg, was not on the ballot there. He will be on the ballot next week, Super Tuesday. He's already spent over $200 million in ads out of a total of $500+ million out there, and in those, I think on Super Tuesday alone, about $200 million. So thus, Joe Biden, you won't hear from him on the air in California. There's really no reason to be on the air in California. And very little in Texas. Didn't have the organization, didn't have the campaign general staff. Jim Clyburn talked about that they were a little bit, as Dave Jones would say, dodgy. No doubt about that, a dodgy campaign, a rocky campaign. But what people have to understand is this is much larger than just the African American vote or followers of O.J. Simpson. They're using multiple candidates to block Bernie Sanders, no doubt about that. Bernie Sanders has the most progressive program in Medicare for All, in terms of social justice, and in terms of various other issues across the board, the environment, etc. And that was one thing Tom Steyer had been engaged in, environmental justice and social justice there in South Carolina. Where Tom Steyer goes beyond this, will be very interesting to see where it goes from there. And the approach, the campaigns, not the campaigns, the DMC, and how they are handling the African American vote. Now, yes, there are more people out there, political consultants now that were not around in 2008. But what is the buy to traditional African American media? Now, in South Carolina, Tom Steyer spent very heavily on African American media, had his events in African American restaurants, etc., and newspapers there. But the other spending, of course, the Biden campaign didn't have any money. What are they doing? And you have these candidates there. You have, of course, Mini Mike. Mini Mike has invested heavily in the Super Tuesday states. He's come out with a so-called Greenwood plan. That's the community down in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was destroyed by white supremacists in the 20s. And he has an economic component there. Some of the other candidates, one in particular has not caught on. This is another candidate is taking this so-called moderate lane to block Bernie Sanders. Is the mayor former mayor actually, from South Bend, Indiana, Buttigieg, Buttigieg did not do well in South Carolina. He was wasting his time. He went on very quickly in North Carolina, to Virginia, and other places, and to Texas, etc. He will be in a Super Tuesday. Where he goes to Super Tuesday, who knows? He's not going very far without attracting African American voters, because all these people are basically competing for the same type of vote there. As far as Tom Steyer, it doesn't really matter. He can continue on. He has the funds to do it. This leaves Amy Klobuchar, and we'll talk a little about her campaign in a minute here. An article from a paper in South Carolina. She was at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro. Actually, excuse me, this is in North Carolina. Okay, anyway, I always get those Carolinas mixed up. So that comes next week, so that is appropriate that we do that. But before we do, let's go to... where do we want to go here? We want to go to Real Clear Politics and look at some of those polls out of South Carolina, because very important to look back at some of those polls and see exactly where we are. Just a second here. We'll eventually find this. Just a second. Yeah, we'll get real clear here and just look at the South Carolina polls. Now, on the week that was, we'll have the final numbers from South Carolina. We don't have those now, but what this will do is kind of a snapshot of what's going on, what went on tonight. The polls are fairly accurate. Take a look here. Particularly, these polls are relevant to African Americans. Now, we had, let's see, on Thursday, we had the Emerson poll. Now, that is fairly accurate. It put Biden up by 16. And then we also had the Monmouth poll out of Jersey. Biden was up by 20. The Post and Courier, now that is a South Carolina poll, newspaper there in South Carolina, had Biden up by only 4. Now, it tended to be the outliner in this whole situation, had Bernie at 24. That did not happen. But let's go to the, I think, the Post and Courier poll. I'm not sure which one we're going to right now. Yeah, this is the Post and Courier poll out of the Pimento State. Shows Biden lead over Sanders, continues to lead. And this is where we get some breakdown. Strong support among the voters who casted as African American voters in the Pimento State. And we'll see where that went. This is fairly accurate with some of the exit polls we looked at here. And African American voters his backing in ranges from 24 to 57%. According to this, he got around 57% in new polls, well ahead of his rivals. Some of the polls came before Biden received the endorsement of Jim Clyburn. Anyway, so with Bernie, well, Bernie got buried in 2016. Tom Steyer, most found 10% of the voters undecided. That's days before the primary on Saturday. And 8 previous polls. Now, this is one thing to remember. Biden margin over his challenges ranged from 31%, that was in May, to a low of 5% last month there. But again, he has never trailed any of the 34 real clear politic polls. So this tells you right there, period, where Biden was in that state, a moderate state, a little bit different type of state there. And we have a Lexington political consulting that's called the Starboard. It works with Republican candidates, found that Biden held 40% of the support. And that poll was fairly accurate with the exit polls at Tom Steyer at 12, Bernie at 11. Bernie will do better than 11. It was off there, but and then we get to the Monmouth poll. Had Biden at about 36, about where he ended up doubling Sanders 16%. The latest I heard, Bernie is at about 16% there in that poll. And they had the Clemson University poll, Biden at 35%, Sanders at 13%. He's going to overperform that. Winthrop University, that's another one, released a poll last week before his second finish there. He had a 5 percentage point over Bernie Sanders there. But again, all these polls pretty much, and we're starting to see a lot of that these days, that they are mimicking what actually is going on with some of the exit polls. Very remarkable. And a lot of early polling will the result in South Carolina affect Super Tuesday? No, not as much effect there, because what has happened, many people have already voted. And from Dr. Kimball, now this is at Emerson College, their poll, South Carolina looks like it will be a strong firewall for Biden, who's been waiting for it. In this case, the question is, game changer, merely a speed bump? Well, the problem is on Super Tuesday, very difficult. It has him at about 39% of the support there, and they had Bernie at 37. Bernie did not make 37 there, while voters who decided sometime in the prior months, Biden is at 43 and Bernie is at 15 there. Voters looking for their choice at 73% said they would definitely vote for the preferred candidate this time. 85% of Sanders supporters, and 75 of his. But now Biden is strong amongst African Americans, and this is our broadcast here, leading with support of 48%. In that poll, next among is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders did not get to 27%, and Tom Steyer dropped down to 12% of the support there. And Mayor Petey didn't really play in the issue there. So, and we look back here, Clinton in the primary, Biden received a majority of voters who went with Clinton, 56%. And Warren and Amy in the single digits. Those who supported Sanders in 2016 plan to vote for him again. 19% have voted for him. Now, this is an interesting number here. 14% went with Biden. Let's see if we can get the age groups. The majority turned the debate amongst those who watched. 39% said Biden performed the best, followed by 18% who thought Sanders did. 12% said Mayor Petey did. 11% Steyer, and 6% Amy Klobuchar. Well, Amy didn't get into the debate, but she did better than Bloomberg. And 21% of the voters said they would have voted for Bloomberg had he been on the ballot. Now, if he'd been on the ballot, if that happened to be the case, Bloomberg takes nearly half of his support from Biden and 12% from Sanders. Unbelievable there. Remaining went from the remaining people, Amy, Steyer, and Little Petey. Bloomberg stated goal is to keep Sanders from getting a nomination. Yet his vote suggests his strategy might actually benefit Sanders by splitting up the moderate vote. Well, we'll see if that works in the states coming up on a Super Tuesday period. So this is basically that part of the vote, and to look back on where the exit polling actually is there. And let's get a story here. This is interesting. This is in North Carolina with Amy Klobuchar. She made a campaign swing on Thursday morning through the Gate City to take part in a panel discussion on voting rights and election security. Her campaign rented space in the International Civil Rights Center and Museum for an event that drew hundreds of area residents. She said at the outset that she hoped to focus the discussion on the need to make it easier to vote and improve election security and tighten rules of governing money in politics. She felt it was important to have discussion here in North Carolina because of the struggles have been here with voting rights. One of a half dozen Democrats currently thought to be have some potential to win their nomination. Klobuchar, who represented Minnesota in the Senate since 2007, she was actually there before Barack Obama got to Washington, at the former Woolworth turned museum, which celebrated the 1960s sit-in marches that integrated lunch counters and helped ignite the civil rights movement. She and three other panelists discussed efforts led by North Carolina's Republican-led General Assembly that they say were motivated and desire to suppress the African-American vote. It's very important that candidates in this race focus on the African-American vote. This is the reason that we included this article here. She said, for example, she's tried in vain to get legislation for the Senate that would end the process of purging voter rolls of people who had gone several elections without voting. Just because you haven't voted for a few elections, you don't lose your right to vote. And no doubt about that, very important. On the other panel, included the North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Nita Earls, the representative here, Sidney Batch, and Derek Smith, an activist who teaches at North Carolina A&M. Earls said she was on the panel because of her many years of prior experience as a civil rights lawyer and avoided commenting on issues that might be coming before the court. But she said voter suppression efforts were real and urged people to report such incidents to nonpartisan groups. And let's see what else we have here. But she said Smith said that one needed reform was to reinstate provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to screen federal officers screen changes in voting laws made in states like North Carolina that have a history of discrimination. Amy Klobuchar said she favors legislation that requires the use of paper ballots, which they did use today in South Carolina. Required use there enables people to vote at the same time they register, and automatic registration register teens when they turn 18. But old man McConnell may call and stop the bill from going to the floor. Klobuchar is in her third term representing Minnesota. She is claimed is a moderate Democrat, but she has not risen in the ranks of leading candidates with her percentage support amongst Democratic voters. It remains in the single digits. Thursday marks her first visit to North Carolina of the 2020 campaign. She told audience she knew Greensboro well as a place that held happy and sad memories. Well, no doubt about that. I went to Greensboro many, many times ago. She remembers it happily as a place where she had visited Kate Hagen before the former senator became ill. The sadness stems from her later memory of attending Hagen's funeral. I miss her very much. She was one of my best friends in the Senate. Of her late colleague who died last year at her Greensboro home of encephalitis. She contacted from a tick 2016. I didn't know that. The audience erupted in applause and cheers when Smith noted that the 6th Congressional District Republican incumbent Mark Walker of Greensboro was not seeking re-election. The district redrawn recently to overcome vintages of partisan gerrymandering. So there are opportunities coming up, particularly in places like Greensboro, in North Carolina. Left for Raleigh, where she would hold an afternoon, a campaign event followed. She had a town hall on Fox News event. Cook said she's planning to return to Washington to discharge some Senate duties on Friday and be back in North Carolina. Well, she's no doubt back there and moving on. for Super Tuesday. And Bloomberg will be there. He'll be campaigning in Greensboro. Or he campaigned that 2 weeks ago, playing weekend appearance in Wilmington and Charlotte. And Amy Klobuchar incidentally spoke tonight at the Blue NC celebration. That is a dinner there, period there. So all of these candidates are moving around there that freedom fighters were in. So this shows a historic link between the past in places like Greensboro, North Carolina. I remember the last time I was through there a long time ago. This would have been in the 70s. A woman picked up, I was on my way out west. A woman literally picked us up. We were hitchhiking, and there was a gentleman there from Arkansas that was a political science major work, and we were literally followed by the White Citizens Council through some of the mountains there, and she turned off to go to her whatever town it was, and this particular person said, well, he could go with her. I said, nah, I'll get out, and I caught a ride and eventually ended up moving on westward towards Nashville, doing a little organizing for the party there at the same time. Anyway, that is that story. Let me wrap this down with Katherine Johnson, one of the people that we look back upon with great pride. She died at 101. This is she's a mathematician, broke barriers at NASA. There, they asked Katherine Johnson for the moon, and she gave it there using a little more than a pencil, a slide rule, and one of the finest mathematical minds in the country, Mrs. Johnson, who died 101 on Monday at a retirement home in Newport News, Virginia. Calculated precise trajectories that let Apollo 11 land on the moon. That was in 1969, after Neil Armstrong's history-making moonwalk, and let it return to Earth. A single error, she knew, could have dire consequences for the craft and the crew. Her impeccable calculations already helped Alan Shepard, who became the first American in space with his Mercury spacecraft. That was in 1961. The next year, she likewise helped make it possible for John Glenn. He had Mercury Friendship 7 to become the first American to orbit the Earth. Yet, though, throughout the 33 years at NASA's Flight Research Division, the office from which American space programs sprung, and for decades after, almost no one knew her name. She was one of hundreds of rigorously educated, supremely capable, yet largely heralded women who, well before the modern feminist movement, worked as NASA mathematicians. But not only her sex, it kept long marginalized and long unsung. Katherine Coleman Globe Johnson, a West Virginia native who began her scientific career in the age of Jim Crow, was also African American. In 2017, Hidden Figures received the Actors Guild Award. That's the Screen Actors Guild Award for an outstanding performance by a cast in motion picture. The film was nominated for 3 Oscars, including Best Picture, although it won none. The 98-and-a-half-year-old at the time, Ms. Johnson received standing ovation when she appeared on stage with the cast at the Academy ceremony that February. Of the African American women at the center in the film, Johnson was the only one still living at the time of its release. By then, she had become better known for her former unknown cohorts. In 2015, President Barack Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, proclaiming Katherine G. Johnson's refusal to be limited by society's expectations of her gender and race, which, while expanding the boundaries of humanity's reach. In 2017, NASA dedicated a building in her honor, the Katherine C. Johnson Computation Research Facility at the Langer Research Center. that is in Hampton, Virginia. That year, the Post described her as the most high profile of the computers. Women were literally human computers in those days, period. Consigned to separate offices, dining rooms, even bathroom facilities, they were kept separated from the much larger group of European women who also worked at NASA as mathematicians. The European women, in turn, were segregated from the male mathematicians, engineers. It was not a good time. Over time, the work of Johnson and her colleagues, the myriad calculations done mainly by hand, using slide rules, graph paper, cluttering in desktop calculating machines, won them a level of acceptance that, for the most part, transcend race. Well, it didn't exactly, but it must have been a very professional organization, she told the Observer of Fayetteville, North Carolina in 2010. They didn't have time to be concerned about what color I was, nor, she said, did she. I didn't have a feeling of inferiority. She said on at least one occasion, never had. I'm as good as anybody, but no better. To the end of her life, Johnson deflected praise from her role in sending astronauts into space and keeping them on course and bringing them home separately. I was just doing my job, period. But what job it was, done no less than by a woman born at the time, Mrs. Shatterly wrote. Shatterly, incidentally, wrote a book here. Heard her interviewed on, I believe, BBC, when the odds were likely that she would die before the age of 35 than ever finish high school. Excuse me. Corello Catherine Coleman was born on August 26, 1918, in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, the youngest of 4 children, Joshua, Gillette, and Lo Coleman. Her mother was a school teacher. Her father was a farmer. Her early childhood, from her earliest childhood, counted things and numbers of dishes, etc., number of steps on the way to church, as insurmountable tasks as it might pose for one old enough, again, in a number of stars in the sky. I couldn't wait to get to high school to take algebra and geometry, she told the Associated Press in 1999. But for African American children, the town's segregated system went only as far as 6th grade. Though every fall, Joshua Coleman moved his family 125 miles away to Institution. In Institutions, Catherine's oldest sibling, and then Catherine attended the high school associated with the West Virginia Collegiate Institution, historically African institution, American institution in West Virginia, that became West Virginia State College and is now West Virginia State University. Mr. Coleman remained in White Sulphur Springs to farm, and when the Depression made farming untenable, to work as a bellman at a Greenbrier, a world-renowned resort. I stayed there once. Anyway, she entered high school at 10 and graduated at 14. This shows you how extraordinary she was. The next year, she entered West Virginia State. By her junior year, she had taken all the math courses that college had to offer. Her mentor, William Creighton, only the third African-American person to earn a doctorate in math from an American university, conceived special classes for her. You can make a good research mathematician, he told the 17-year-old charge. And I'm going to prepare you for this career. Where will I find a job, she asked. It's always a question. After graduating summa cum laude in 1937, in the heat of the Depression, with double majors in mathematics and French, she found unsurprisingly that research opportunities for African-American female mathematicians were negligible. She took a job as a school teacher in Marion, Virginia. In 1940, she was chosen by the President of West Virginia state to be one of 3 black graduate students to integrate West Virginia University, the all-white institution that was in Morgantown, still there. 2 years earlier, ruling the civil rights case, Missouri Gaines versus Canada, the Supreme Court held that where comparable graduate programs did not exist at African universities in Missouri, the state was obligated to admit African graduate students to its so white European universities. West Virginia's Governor Homer Holt chose to desegregate the public graduate school in his state. It was very forward-looking for those days. Married to James Francis Globe, a chemistry teacher, she entered West Virginia University in the summer of 1940. Studying advanced mathematics, the greatest challenge she faced, as Shedley said, was finding a course that didn't duplicate Dr. Creighton's mathematical tutelage. But after the summer session, on discovering that she was pregnant with her first child, she withdrew from the university. She returned with husband Marion, and was occupied with marriage, motherhood, and teaching more than a decade. In 1952, Karen Globe heard that Langley was hiring African American women as mathematicians. The oldest field center, NASA's oldest field center, Langley, was established by the National Advisory Council Committee for Aeronautics in 1917. In 1935, it began hiring European women with math degrees to relieve its male engineers for more tedious work of crunching numbers by hand. Within a decade, several hundred women had been employed as computers there. Most unlikely, the male scientists at the agency were classified as sub-professionals, paid less than their male counterparts. In 1941, as the nation prepared for war, FDR signed Executive Order 8802, barring racial discrimination in the defense industry. In 1943, the wartime need for human computers, greater than ever, the Langley Memorial Aeronautics Lab, as a research center was then known, began advertising for African American women trained in mathematics. Amongst the first hired was Dorothy Vaughan, who began work that year, and in 1951, Ms. Vaughan became the first African American selected head there. Advisory committee was known when she was officially placed in charge of Langley's West Area Computing Unit, the segregated office to which African American women were relegated. By the time she arrived, the company's cafeteria had already undergone de facto desegregation. Its colored computer sign, the designated table for in the back for women, had been a casualty of the war years, but the separate bathrooms remained. Catherine Globe broke that color line herself, while the agency's bathroom for African workers was marked as such. Many bathrooms for whites were not. So she ended up in the other bathroom there, the only African American member of the staff. She helped calculate the aerodynamic forces on airplanes, and that task, as she quickly demonstrated, she came armed with an invaluable asset. Anyway, she remained in the division the rest of her career. She said the guys all had graduate degrees in mathematics. They had forgotten all the geometry they knew. By early 60s, with the U.S. Provoked by the Soviet paralysis in space, NASA was under great pressure to launch an astronaut. It fell to the Flight Research Center to do the calculations. Our assignment was trajectory, Johnson explained to the Associated Press. There. So this is very long, but it's good to get it here. Their work was secret, and at times even from the mathematicians themselves. She told the Daily Press, a Virginia newspaper, we were pioneers in the space era. You have to read Aviation Week to find out what you've done. And she said she logged 16-hour days, often falling asleep at the wheel of her car and waking up safely on the side of the road. Anyway, she helped sustain, let's see here, I loved every day of it, she told Shatley. There wasn't one day when I didn't wake up excited to go to work. It helped sustain her through the death of her first husband from a brain cancer. That was in 1956, leaving her at 38 a widow and children. Adolescent daughters. She married James Johnson, an Army captain in 1959. Over the years, Johnson published more than 24 papers, amongst the first women at NASA to be named an co-author of an agency report. Anyway, after retiring, she became a public advocate for mathematics education, speaking wide and visiting schools. Her death was announced by NASA. She's survived by 2 daughters, Jolette Heilich and Catherine Moore, 6 grandkids, etc., etc. Another daughter, Connie Garcia, died in 2010. Her second husband died in last year, 2019, James Johnson. Ms. Johnson's colleague Mary Jackson died in 2005. Virginia Dorothy Vaughn, died in 2008. And autobiography by Ms. Johnson for her younger readers, Reaching for the Moon. Invite you to read that period. So she was around a very, very long time. John Glenn has since died here. He was a favorite of hers. The electronic computations were still somewhat of a novel at NASA, and Mr. Glenn was unsettled by the use of a soulless mass of metal to divide something on which his life depended. He asked Johnson to double-check the machine's figures by hand. If she said the numbers were good, he decided, I'm really going to go. So this is kind of what we meant to do here was illustrate the importance African Americans, particularly African American women, in mathematics. We hear lots about ancient ancestors were around many, many moons in the past and what they perhaps did there. But does that matter? No, it does not matter. What really matters is that African Americans today strive to be properly educated in math and in science and in IT and those kinds of things that we're underrepresented in, and demand that they be hired, demand that they be given the proper education. Those are things that have to happen. You just cannot shoot just for a job, as Jesse Jackson would say. What you need is development, and now sustainable development for the community. African Americans must act, as they have in the past, as a communal people, and not these ragged individuals that pop up on the American shore that do nothing to promote the sustainability of African Americans in this country. And as we transition through demographic change, it brings about political change. African Americans, if you look at California, look at Nevada, and various other places, that Latinos now have the numbers, and as they obtain their voting rights and citizenship, they will be more in the voting pool than African Americans. You can ask Auntie Maxine Waters about that. Her district, that includes Compton and Watts, is now a majority African American district, but she is still there representing the people. So we have to understand where we are in the scheme of things and where we are going to be 5 and 10 years from there. So that is the reason you need a progressive outlet. What you do not need is pandering, and you do not need is a past. Now, yes, President Obama, as the late great Jerry Pippin stated many times, was an Eisenhower Republican. No doubt about that, and that would have been in that when Ike was there. But his basic accomplishment was an African American going in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That was what was resented, no doubt about it. The passage of Obamacare, and the stewardship of the Depression of 2008. That is the number one accomplishment in the economic field. Yes, it was messy, but it was within the framework that he inherited. Many people will say, well, look back at the war in Afghanistan, the drones, the deportation of Latinos back primarily at that time to Mexico. And, well, yes, but that was within the system that was set up there. And his involvement in Afghanistan, that was based upon Wilsonian foreign policy, which was a racist policy. Woodrow Wilson, the man with a PhD, the only one to serve with a PhD, and he was the man responsible for resegregating Washington, D.C. He was a racist, an outright rabid racist, but yet he had a PhD. He had been president of Princeton University. So that tells African Americans, and particularly African Americans, to beware, preventor, out there, and what the struggles are. And particularly now with the medical situation with COVID-19, that is a viral that is going around, a virus that is going around in the coronavirus family, and it has settled first in China, in Wuhan province there, and now it's in the Republic of Korea. Hundreds of people there have been stricken with it, and it's in 56 countries. We continue the count to go up. DJ Trump held a news conference last week talking about it, and then went to a rally in South Carolina and called it a hoax. Well, this is a problem. And this is where Ms. Johnson comes in here, is that African Americans in this country have made strides in science. With Dr. Drew, if you remember Dr. Drew, he's the man that literally invented the blood transfusion and died because he couldn't get to an apartheid and segregated hospital. So thus, we are a science people. We are not a people that believe in rocks and silly putty, period. And this is what has happened. Remember when Barack Obama was in the White House? These naysayers in the community would say, well, what has Barack Obama done for us? They haven't asked DJ Trump. Excuse me. These are the same ancestors of people that questioned Dr. King. Everyone did not support Dr. King when Dr. King was leading the struggle in the South. As many people are there. Rosa Parks couldn't get a job for 10 years until people that were progressive within the and militant within the NAACP made a demand and forced people to hire him. And the late, great John Conyers, remember him, he died last year, hired her in his office, and she had moved to Detroit. And the reason she moved to Detroit, she was literally ran out of Alabama. And that's very important. You can't run around here talking about, well, what Rosa Parks did. They weren't with anybody. But today, the price is much higher. And now the COVID-19 virus is in Washington State. The number there is about 60 in some extended medical care facility. And they have not been able to find anyone around that facility that had been to China, Korea, or any place else. So what this has basically done is it has turned the statements that DJ Trump and his associate Pence, or the Trump-Pence gang, made to be absolutely not true. You don't need a fact checker for that. You need reality. So what this does is it touches on the conspiracy theories that they would like to get into, even the African American community, the anti-vaccine kooks that are out there, the flat earthers, and these other professional pathological liars that are out there. And remember, the conspiracy theorists in this country start out with what? The birthers, the Tea Party. But these were all based on a racial amicus. The same thing as DJ Trump bought full-page ads against the people in the park there, Central Park 5, turned out to be a liar. So what you have to do is, when you confront these liars, is look them in the eye and tell them that they are liars. They have no authority. And that authority is disappearing by the day, politically. And if Bernie Sanders and the progressives use it as an impetus for Medicare for All, which benefits people of color, African Americans, Latinos, and we saw that showdown out in Nevada, that the union there, the Commemorates union, tried to sneak in there and stop Bernie Sanders by saying, well, this would cancel our insurance policy. The Latinos said, no, we know we have good insurance, but we want our brothers and sisters also to have it because we are collective people. And that is one of the issues, that this is a day that, a month, that Dr. Woodson founded. And at that time it was one day, then it became the short month called Negro History Month, and then it was Black History Month, and now it is African History Month, although the newspapers have not decided to go with it. So again, we have enormous struggles out here that we're confronted with, and will continue to be confronted on Super Tuesday. We encourage people to go out and vote that are in the Democratic Party, are eligible to vote out there. We don't tell you whom to vote for. That's up to you. But what we do say is the progressive way, particularly with the COVID-19 situation coming in here, it has a tremendous political effect and impact on the healthcare system. Trump tried to put it out that they have the best healthcare system in the world. Turned out to be a lie. They even have the test kits out in the States. They've since got some out there. But they were not ready, and still not fully ready. And the strains on the system, now you have to remember that many of these hospitals, medical centers in small town, rural America, have went out of business, closed down. Trump cut Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, their budget, cut other budgets by 60%. That would just not work out. The change has got here, and it suddenly got here, that the country has to allocate. He asked for $2.5 billion. It's up to $8 billion, and it'll be more than that, because this thing is no joke, period. And not only that, it impact the economic sphere there. The market lost around, let's see, I've got it here, 11-12% of its value. Well, incidentally, on the network, we'll have the numbers man unit, that is our macroeconomics unit, this weekend. We'll also wrap up South Carolina on the week that was. We'll get that out to you. And as we move along, wherever you get your internet radio /podcast, it can be iHeart, it can be at Google, it can be at Stitcher, it can be on Twitter, and at many other destinations. You can go there and find our broadcasts. Some of them are a little time delayed, but we get these broadcasts out normally every week, and we continue to do that. Open Source Report, we'll get back to it. That'll be on voting, very timely issue as we continue on. Now, on the Monday morning quarterback, we'll preview a preview of Super Tuesday. We'll also wrap up Super Tuesday late Tuesday night if they're available. We'll probably get the projections from the Associated Press or whomever, or we'll do them ourselves there. And as we move along there, so have a good rest of your weekend here. This is Boston Red in the Jerry Pippin broadcast booth. Good evening.